My twin sister convinced our parents to pay for her dream wedding by telling them I didn't want one, so I showed up to her rehearsal dinner with my own engagement ring. Growing up with Cassandra was like living with a master manipulator who happened to share my DNA. While I was the responsible one, straight A's, scholarship to nursing school, working part-time to help with family expenses, she was the golden child who could do no wrong. Mom and Dad would excuse her failed classes, her maxed-out credit cards, her string of dramatic breakups that somehow always required family intervention. The pattern started early. When we were 8, Cassandra broke Mom's favorite vase while dancing in the living room. She convinced our parents that I'd dared her to do it, that I was the real culprit because I'd been jealous of her dance recital performance. I spent a week grounded while she got sympathy for being led astray by her troublemaker sister. In high school, she crashed Dad's car after sneaking out to a party. Somehow, she managed to convince them it was my fault for not stopping her, even though I'd been at home studying for my SATs. She got a new car for her birthday 2 months later. I got a lecture about being a better sister. The manipulation was so subtle, so expertly crafted, that even I sometimes doubted myself. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too serious, too judgmental, too focused on rules and responsibilities. Cassandra had a gift for making her victims complicit in their own destruction. When Cassandra got engaged to Preston last year, she immediately started planning what she called her fairy tale wedding. Preston came from money, old New England wealth that made our middle-class family feel shabby by comparison. His previous girlfriend had been a debutante who summered in the Hamptons. Cassandra was determined to prove she belonged in that world. The budget quickly spiraled from reasonable to astronomical. Venue rental for the most exclusive country club in the county, a designer dress that cost more than most people's cars, a destination bachelor party in Cabo that required chartered planes, flowers flown in from Ecuador because the local ones weren't exotic enough, a photographer who'd shot celebrity weddings, a cake that required its own refrigerated truck for transport. Every time Mom and Dad questioned an expense, Cassandra had a sob story ready. She'd always dreamed of this moment. She deserved to feel like a princess for one day. Preston's family would judge us if the wedding wasn't up to their standards. We only get one chance to make a first impression on his social circle. When Mom and Dad finally saw the final estimate of $47,000, their faces went white. Dad worked as a manager at the hardware store, Mom as a secretary at the elementary school. That amount represented nearly a full year of their combined salaries, before taxes. They sat us both down for a family meeting at the kitchen table where we'd had countless conversations about grades, curfews, and college plans. That's when Cassandra pulled her masterstroke. She turned to our parents with tears already pooling in her eyes, a trick she'd perfected over the years, and began her performance. She said I'd confided in her just the week before about my feelings toward weddings, that I'd told her I thought they were outdated patriarchal rituals designed to bankrupt families for one day of showing off, that I'd rather put any wedding money toward a house down payment or graduate school, that I'd told her I'd be perfectly content with a courthouse ceremony or maybe just living together without the formal commitment. She painted me as the practical sister who rolled her eyes at romantic gestures, who mocked couples who spent money on engagement rings when they could invest it instead. She claimed I'd laughed at her Pinterest boards and called her dreams frivolous and materialistic. The worst part? Some of it was actually true. I had mentioned that some weddings seemed excessive, particularly the ones that put families into debt for a single day of celebration. I had said that I'd be fine with something small and intimate. I had questioned whether spending more on flowers than some families made in a month was really necessary. But Cassandra took those reasonable observations and twisted them into a caricature of who I was. She made me sound cold, unromantic, judgmental, everything I'd never wanted to be but sometimes feared I might be. Mom looked at me with this mixture of disappointment and relief, disappointed that her daughter wasn't interested in one of life's most beautiful celebrations, but relieved that they'd only need to fund one elaborate wedding instead of planning for 2. Dad nodded approvingly at Cassandra, his face softening as it always did when he looked at his golden child. "You've always been our romantic," he said, reaching over to squeeze her hand, "ever since you were little, planning weddings for your dolls. We want your special day to be perfect." I sat there stunned as they agreed to cover her entire wedding budget. Money that I knew came from the college fund they'd originally set up for both of us when we were born. Money I could have used to finish nursing school without working nights at the diner, coming home exhausted and falling asleep over my textbooks. Money that represented years of their sacrifices, skipped vacations, and secondhand clothes. But what could I say? If I protested, I'd look petty and jealous. If I corrected Cassandra's version of events, I'd seem like I was competing with her on her special day. She'd backed me into a corner so elegantly that I could only sit there and smile while my future was redistributed to fund her fantasy. For the next 8 months, I watched Cassandra plan her extravaganza while working double shifts to pay my tuition. Every family dinner conversation revolved around centerpieces and menu tastings and dress fittings. She'd hold court at the table, showing photos of potential hairstyles and describing the imported linens she'd selected. Meanwhile, I was practically invisible, the sister who didn't believe in romance, who'd chosen practicality over dreams. The worst moments came when well-meaning relatives would ask about my own relationship plans. Cassandra would jump in before I could answer, explaining that I was too focused on my career to think about marriage, that I'd always said I didn't need a man to complete me, that I was the independent one who'd probably stay single forever and travel the world instead. Each lie built upon the previous ones, creating a narrative that became more entrenched with every telling. Soon, even I started to believe it. Maybe I was too practical. Maybe I didn't understand romance the way other women did. Maybe there was something fundamentally different about me that made me unsuitable for the kind of love that warranted celebration. Then I met David at the hospital during my clinical rotation. He was a second-year resident in emergency medicine with kind eyes and steady hands that could start an IV on the most difficult patient. Our first conversation happened during a particularly brutal overnight shift when we'd lost 2 patients within an hour, an elderly man whose heart finally gave out, and a teenager who'd overdosed at a house party. I was sitting in the break room at 3 a.m., still shaking from performing CPR on the kid, when David sat down across from me with 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee. "Rough night," he said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You did everything right," he continued. "Sometimes everything right isn't enough, but you still did it." That's when I started crying, ugly, exhausted tears that I'd been holding back for hours. David didn't try to fix it or explain it away. He just sat there while I fell apart, occasionally pushing the tissue box closer when I needed it. What started as coffee between shifts became long conversations about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a family of doctors who expected him to follow the family tradition, and how he'd almost become an accountant, just to rebel before realizing that medicine was genuinely his calling. I told him about the pressure of being the responsible twin, about working multiple jobs to pay for school while watching my sister live off our parents' generosity. David never made me feel guilty for my ambitions or practical nature. Instead, he seemed fascinated by my ability to find beauty in small moments. The way morning light hit the hospital windows, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed procedure, the quiet pride of helping a family through their worst day. 6 months after we met, he proposed during a quiet moment in the hospital chapel. We'd just finished a 16-hour shift that included a successful trauma surgery and the birth of twins to a mother who'd been told she'd never conceive. The chapel was empty except for us, lit only by the eternal flame and the glow from the parking lot outside. "I don't have a ring yet," he said, taking my hands in his. "And this isn't exactly romantic by most standards, but I realized tonight that I want to spend the rest of my life having these moments with you. The hard ones and the beautiful ones and all the ordinary ones in between." He pulled out a simple solitaire ring. Nothing fancy, but somehow perfect in its understated elegance. I found out later that he'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Not a grand gesture or orchestrated event, but a genuine moment of connection between 2 people who'd found each other in the chaos of saving lives. I said yes before he'd even finished asking. The next day I called Mom to tell her about David. I'd mentioned him casually before, the nice resident I'd been spending time with, but I'd never talked about the depth of our relationship. Partly because I'd been cautious about jinxing something so precious, and partly because I'd internalized Cassandra's narrative that I wasn't the type for serious romance. Mom seemed genuinely surprised that things had progressed so quickly. She asked the usual parental questions about his background, his career prospects, his intentions. Then she paused and asked the question I'd been dreading. "So what are you thinking in terms of timing? For the wedding, I mean." I took a deep breath. "We're hoping for something in the spring. Small and simple. Maybe at the church where you and Dad got married." Another pause. "Honey, you know your father and I already committed the wedding budget to Cassandra's celebration." "I know," I said quickly. "We wouldn't expect you to pay for anything. We're planning to handle it ourselves." But I could hear the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating the optics of one daughter getting a lavish celebration, while the other paid her own way. She was remembering Cassandra's version of events, that I didn't want a traditional wedding anyway. "Well," she said carefully, "that's probably for the best. You always said you preferred simple celebrations." Except I'd never said that. Not exactly. But Cassandra's lies had become family truth, repeated so often that even Mom couldn't separate what I'd actually said from what she'd been told I believed. After I hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment feeling more alone than I had since childhood. The man I loved wanted to marry me, but my own family couldn't celebrate that joy because they'd already decided I wasn't the type of person who deserved celebration. That's when I realized I had 2 choices. I could accept the narrative that had been created about me and have the small, forgettable wedding that everyone expected. Or I could reclaim my own story and show my family who I really was. I chose the latter. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. So I started paying closer attention to Cassandra's version of events, documenting the lies and exaggerations that had become accepted family history. At Sunday dinner, she mentioned how I'd told her that engagement rings were a scam perpetrated by the diamond industry. I'd never said that. What I'd actually said was that some couples seem to prioritize the ring over the relationship, but I'd never criticized the tradition itself. During a conversation with our aunt, Cassandra claimed I'd said that wedding photographers were a waste of money because everyone had phone cameras now. Again, not true. I'd mentioned that some wedding photography packages seemed overpriced, but I'd never dismissed the importance of capturing those memories. She was systematically rewriting every casual comment I'd ever made, turning reasonable observations into extreme positions that painted me as someone fundamentally opposed to romance and celebration. The most hurtful lie came during a conversation with our grandmother, who'd been married for 63 years and still wore her original wedding ring, despite the arthritis that made it difficult to get on and off. Grandma had pulled me aside to ask about David, and I'd been excitedly telling her about our engagement when Cassandra interrupted. "Grandma, you should know that she's only doing this because of peer pressure," Cassandra said with a conspiratorial whisper. "She told me she thinks marriage is an outdated institution, but David really wanted the traditional ceremony." My grandmother's face fell. She looked at me with such disappointment that I felt physically sick. "Oh, honey," she said sadly, "marriage isn't something you do for someone else. It's something you do because you can't imagine your life without that person. I tried to explain that Cassandra had misunderstood, but the damage was done. Grandma spent the rest of the visit talking to Cassandra about wedding traditions, while treating my engagement like an unfortunate obligation I'd been pressured into. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started recording my conversations with my best friend Rachel, documenting my real feelings about marriage, weddings, and David. I needed evidence of who I actually was, not who Cassandra claimed I was. In those recordings, my genuine excitement was unmistakable. I talked about how David made me feel seen and valued. I described my vision for our wedding, intimate but meaningful, simple but beautiful. I discussed my fears about living up to the marriage examples set by my parents and grandparents, and my hopes for building something lasting with the man I loved. Most importantly, I captured my confusion and hurt over my family's reaction to my engagement. I couldn't understand why they seemed so resigned about my wedding, why they treated it like a necessary evil rather than a celebration. I didn't know then that their reactions were based on a fictional version of me that Cassandra had carefully constructed. Meanwhile, Cassandra's wedding preparations reached a fever pitch. The final month involved daily crises that required family intervention. The florist threatened to cancel because she'd changed her mind about the arrangement 6 times. The photographer demanded additional payment because she'd expanded the shot list to include a pre-wedding photo shoot at 3 different locations. The caterer needed overtime authorization because she decided she wanted a cocktail hour, seated dinner, and late-night dessert service. Each crisis brought more drama, more tears, more demands for understanding and support. Mom took personal days from work to handle vendor calls. Dad worked overtime to cover the additional expenses. Extended family members were recruited to help with setup, transportation, and coordination. Through it all, I continued working my shifts at the hospital and planning my own wedding on weekends. David and I met with the pastor at our childhood church, arranged for simple flowers from the local farmer's market, and planned a reception at the community center where I'd volunteered as a teenager. Our biggest expense was the photographer, a friend from nursing school who agreed to shoot our wedding in exchange for covering her textbook costs. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Cassandra's wedding required a 3-ring binder to track all the vendors and timelines. My wedding planning fit in a single folder that I kept on my kitchen table, but I was happy. David and I were building something real together, something that didn't require elaborate staging or expensive props. We were choosing each other not because of what we could provide or how we looked together, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company and shared the same values about what mattered in life. 2 weeks before Cassandra's wedding, I realized I needed to make a statement, not to hurt her or steal her spotlight, but to reclaim my own identity from the caricature she'd created. The rehearsal dinner was the perfect opportunity. It would be attended by extended family who'd heard Cassandra's version of events, Preston's family who'd been told I was the practical sister who didn't believe in romance, and family friends who'd accepted the narrative that I was somehow fundamentally different from other women my age. I chose my outfit carefully. A dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, sophisticated but not competitive with whatever bridal look Cassandra had planned. I had my engagement ring cleaned and resized so it would catch the light properly. And I prepared what I wanted to say, rehearsing the words until they felt natural and confident. David was nervous about the plan. He worried that it would create unnecessary drama or hurt feelings, but he also understood why it was necessary. He'd seen how my family's perception of me had affected my self-confidence, how I sometimes doubted my own desires, because they didn't match the story Cassandra had told about me. "You deserve to be seen for who you really are," he told me the night before the rehearsal dinner. "And if they can't see that, it says more about them than it does about you." The rehearsal dinner was held at the country club, naturally. Cassandra had insisted on the most expensive private dining room, complete with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. She'd hired the same florist who was doing the wedding flowers to create centerpieces for the rehearsal dinner because every event needed to meet her aesthetic standard. When David and I arrived, Cassandra was holding court in the center of the room, wearing a flowing white dress that made her look like a Greek goddess. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them dressed in coordinated pastels that had probably been selected months in advance. They were cooing over her manicure and discussing the timeline for tomorrow's hair and makeup appointments. Preston stood with his groomsmen near the bar, looking handsome but slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the celebration. His parents were chatting with my parents near the windows, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, and speaking in the elevated tones people use at expensive venues. The room fell silent when I walked in wearing my best dress, my engagement ring catching the candlelight from the elaborate centerpieces. Cassandra's champagne flute froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes went directly to my left hand, and I watched her face process what she was seeing. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like panic. Preston looked confused, glancing between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Mom's face went through about 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Surprise, joy, confusion, worry, and finally a kind of resigned dread as she realized what was about to happen. Dad was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. "Is that what I think it is?" I smiled. Not smugly or triumphantly, but with genuine happiness, and held up my left hand, letting the diamond catch the light from the chandelier above us. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my fiancé, David. We're getting married in 3 months. David appeared beside me, slipping his arm around my waist with the quiet confidence he brought to every crisis situation. He smiled warmly at the room full of shocked faces. "I'm honored to be joining this family," he said in his steady physician's voice, "and we're excited to share our news with everyone who matters to us." The explosion that followed was immediate and multi-layered. Cassandra shot to her feet so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. Her face had gone from bridal glow to something approaching fury. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising above the civilized murmur that had characterized the evening until now. "This is my weekend, my rehearsal dinner. Tomorrow is my wedding day." But even as she spoke, I could see her calculating the impact. This wasn't just about timing or attention. This was about the fundamental story she'd built about our family dynamic, about who we were and what we wanted from life. Mom looked genuinely stricken, her hand pressed to her chest like she was having trouble breathing. "Honey, why didn't you tell us you were seeing someone seriously?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Why hadn't I confided in them? Why had they been left out of something so important? Why were they learning about my engagement at my sister's rehearsal dinner instead of through a joyful phone call or family meeting? "Because you never asked," I replied, keeping my voice calm and level. "You've been so focused on Cassandra's wedding for the past 8 months that I didn't think you'd be interested in hearing about my boring practical life." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of recognition and discomfort throughout the room. Several of the relatives shifted uncomfortably, remembering conversations where they'd been told I was too career-focused for romance, too practical for traditional celebrations. Dad's face was reddening in the way it always did when he felt caught between his daughters. "This is incredibly selfish," he said, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. "Tomorrow is your sister's day. This could have waited." David stepped forward slightly, and I felt the calm, professional presence that made him so effective in medical emergencies. His voice carried the same tone he used to de-escalate situations in the ER, respectful but firm, acknowledging the tension without being intimidated by it. "Mr. Richardson, I apologize if our timing seems inconsiderate," he said. "We actually came tonight specifically to share our news with family and to congratulate Cassandra on her wedding. We thought this would be an appropriate time to announce our engagement to the people who matter most to us." But Cassandra wasn't listening to diplomatic explanations. Her face had gone from flushed to pale, and I could see the gears turning in her head as she processed what this meant. She was calculating the impact on tomorrow's celebration, measuring how much attention this would steal from her carefully orchestrated moment. More than that, she was realizing that her version of events was about to be publicly challenged. For months, she'd been telling people that I didn't want a traditional wedding, that I was too practical for romantic gestures, that I looked down on couples who spent money on celebrations. Now I was standing in front of everyone with an engagement ring, clearly happy and in love, contradicting every story she'd told. "You planned this," she hissed, her voice carrying across the room despite her attempt to keep it low. "You did this on purpose to ruin my wedding. You couldn't stand that I was getting everything I wanted, so you had to find a way to make it about you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Every eye in the room was on us now, family members and friends trying to understand the dynamics they were witnessing. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm that came from finally being able to tell the truth. "Actually, Cassandra, I planned this because I realized something important. You told Mom and Dad that I didn't want a wedding, that I thought they were wasteful and outdated, that I'd rather elope or just go to City Hall if I ever got married. Remember saying that?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several people shifted in their chairs, and I could see recognition dawning on the faces of family members who'd heard versions of this story over the past months. Mom looked between us with growing confusion, her face showing the first signs of understanding that something was seriously wrong with the narrative she'd accepted. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What exactly are you saying?" Cassandra's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route or someone who might help her control the narrative that was slipping away from her. But I wasn't done. I'd been silent for too long, accepting a version of myself that bore no resemblance to who I actually was. "The truth is," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I do want a wedding. I want to celebrate finding the person I'm going to spend my life with. I want our families to come together and witness our commitment to each other. I want to wear a beautiful dress and exchange vows and have pictures to show our children someday. I want all the things you said I didn't care about." The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the distant sounds of the kitchen staff preparing dessert, the soft jazz music playing in the background, the tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Mom's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "I don't understand what's happening here." That's when one of Cassandra's bridesmaids, her college roommate who'd never particularly liked me, spoke up with the kind of tactless directness that only comes from too much champagne. "Wait, so you do want a wedding? But Cassandra said you thought they were stupid. She said you called her Pinterest boards materialistic and told her she was wasting money on flowers." The moment stretched out like a held breath. I could see family members processing what they'd just heard, comparing it to conversations they'd had with Cassandra over the past months. The story she'd told about me was beginning to unravel in real time. That's when I saw it. The exact moment when Mom and Dad realized what had happened. Dad's face went through a series of expressions, starting with confusion and ending on something I'd never seen him direct at Cassandra before. Profound disappointment mixed with a kind of horrified understanding. Mom's hand went to her throat, and she looked between Cassandra and me like she was seeing us both clearly for the first time in months. "Cassandra," Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "What exactly did you tell us about your sister?" The lies started immediately. Cassandra launched into a performance that would have been worthy of an Oscar nomination, talking about misunderstandings and miscommunications, and how she'd been trying to protect everyone from awkwardness. She claimed that I'd changed my mind about marriage, that I was only getting engaged now because I was jealous of her happiness and wanted to compete with her special day. She painted herself as the innocent victim of a vindictive sister who couldn't stand to see her succeed. She suggested that my timing was deliberately cruel, that I was trying to steal attention from her wedding out of petty jealousy, but I was ready for this. I'd known Cassandra long enough to predict exactly how she'd try to control the narrative once it started slipping away from her. I pulled out my phone and accessed the voice recordings I'd made over the past months, conversations with my best friend where I'd processed my feelings about the engagement, the wedding planning, and my family's strange reaction to my happiness. The first recording was from the day after David proposed. My voice was clear and unmistakably happy as I described the proposal, our plans for a small wedding, and my excitement about starting a life together. There was no trace of the practical, unromantic person Cassandra had described. The second recording was from 2 months later, after I'd realized how differently my family was treating my engagement compared to Cassandra's. In it, I sounded confused and hurt as I tried to understand why my own parents seemed so resigned about my wedding, why they acted like it was an obligation rather than a celebration. But the most damaging recording was from just 3 weeks ago, when I'd finally put together what had happened. My voice was steady but angry, as I described to Rachel exactly how Cassandra had twisted my words, how she'd manipulated our parents into funding her dream wedding by convincing them that I didn't want one. When the recordings finished, the room was completely silent. Everyone had heard my actual voice, my real feelings, my genuine confusion and hurt over being misrepresented by my own twin sister. Preston was the first to speak, and his voice was ice cold in a way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "You recorded those conversations months ago?" he asked, his eyes fixed on my phone. I nodded, feeling suddenly exposed despite being the truth teller in the situation. I needed to process what was happening. I never planned to use them like this, but when Cassandra accused me of lying just now, I thought everyone deserved to hear what I actually said versus what she claimed I said. Dad sank into his chair like all the air had left his body. He stared at Cassandra with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror, disappointment, and dawning understanding of how completely he'd been manipulated. "You made us take her college fund for your wedding," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something. "You convinced us that she didn't want a celebration, so we'd spend all our savings on yours." "It wasn't like that," Cassandra protested, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She was spiraling, and everyone could see it. The lies were collapsing under their own weight, and she didn't have a backup plan for this level of exposure. Preston stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor in an echo of Cassandra's earlier outburst. His face was flushed with anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the room like a judge delivering a verdict. "I asked you specifically if your parents were comfortable with this budget. I told you I didn't want to put financial strain on your family. You looked me in the eye and told me they insisted on paying for everything because your sister didn't want a wedding and they were happy to focus all their resources on making yours perfect." The dominoes were falling fast now, each revelation triggering the next as people began to question everything they thought they knew about our family dynamics. One of our aunts spoke up from the back of the room, her voice sharp with indignation. "Wait, that money came from both girls' college funds?" Mom nodded miserably, her face crumpling as she realized the full scope of what had happened. "We'd been saving since they were born. We thought we were giving each girl what she wanted. One to focus on her career without the expense of a wedding, the other to have the celebration she'd dreamed of since childhood." The bridesmaids were exchanging glances now, and I could see the wheels turning as they processed what they were learning. They'd been hearing Cassandra's version of events for months, stories about her practical, career-focused sister who looked down on romantic traditions and thought weddings were a waste of money. Now they were seeing me in person, clearly in love and excited about my own wedding, and the disconnect was impossible to ignore. David squeezed my hand gently, and I could feel him assessing the situation, the way he evaluated patients in the ER, looking for signs of escalation, ready to intervene if things got out of control. "I think we should go," he murmured close to my ear. "We've said what we came to say, but I wasn't done yet. I'd been silent for too long, accepting a false version of myself that had damaged my relationships with the people I loved most. If I was going to reclaim my story, I needed to do it completely. Actually, there's one more thing," I said, reaching into my purse. I pulled out a cream-colored envelope with elegant calligraphy, the wedding invitation David and I had spent hours designing together. I handed it to Mom, whose hands were shaking as she accepted it. "This is our wedding invitation. The ceremony is small, but we'd love to have family there who actually want to celebrate with us." Mom opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out the invitation. Her eyes widened as she read the details. "Where are you having it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The same church where you and Dad got married," I replied. "Pastor Williams remembered me from when I used to volunteer with the youth group during high school. He agreed to perform the ceremony in exchange for a donation to their food bank." The contrast was devastating, and everyone in the room felt it. Cassandra's $47,000 extravaganza at an exclusive country club versus my humble ceremony at the family church, funded by our own hard work and characterized by service to others. The wedding invitation itself told the story. Instead of expensive cardstock and elaborate fonts, we'd chosen simple elegance with meaningful details. The invitation mentioned that in lieu of gifts, we'd requested donations to the children's hospital where we'd met. It included a quote from the book of Corinthians about love being patient and kind, not boastful or proud. Everything about it reflected who David and I actually were: thoughtful, service-oriented, focused on substance over appearance. Preston was staring at Cassandra like he'd never seen her before, his face cycling through emotions as he processed the implications of what he'd learned. "How long have you been lying to me about your family?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Cassandra's composure finally cracked completely. She dissolved into tears, But they weren't the elegant tears of a wronged heroine. They were the messy, desperate tears of someone whose carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling in front of an audience. "I didn't lie," she sobbed, mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark rivulets. I wanted my day to be perfect. I've dreamed about this since I was 5 years old." She doesn't understand what it's like to want something so badly that you'd do anything to make it happen. But her words only made things worse. She was admitting to manipulating the situation while trying to justify it, revealing the calculated nature of her deception while attempting to gain sympathy. That's when David surprised everyone by speaking up, his voice cutting through Cassandra's sobs with the clarity that made him such an effective physician. "Actually," he said quietly, "she understands better than you think. Do you know where I proposed to your sister?" Everyone turned to look at him, confusion replacing the tension for a moment. "In the hospital chapel at 2 a.m. after we'd just lost a patient, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie who'd been fighting leukemia for 3 years. Your sister held that child's hand as she died, then walked into the chapel and broke down. She said she couldn't understand how the world could be so beautiful and so cruel at the same time, how children could suffer while adults worried about trivial things." His voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he continued. "I told her that's exactly why we need love, why we need ceremonies and commitments and celebrations. Not because life is perfect, but because it's not. Because in a world where children die and hearts break and nothing is guaranteed, choosing to love someone anyway is the most hopeful, courageous thing we can do." The room was completely silent now. Even Cassandra's crying had stopped as everyone absorbed what David was saying. "That's when I knew I wanted to marry her," he continued, his eyes finding mine across the room, "not because she doesn't care about romance, but because she understands what it really means. She knows the difference between love and performance, between commitment and spectacle." I felt tears in my eyes for the first time that night. But they weren't tears of anger or frustration. They were tears of gratitude for this man who saw me more clearly than my own family had ever bothered to, who could articulate the depth of my feelings when I'd been rendered speechless by years of being misunderstood. Cassandra looked up from her tissue, mascara streaking down her cheeks like war paint. "But I've already paid for everything," she said, her voice small and defeated. "The deposits, the dress, the flowers that are being delivered tomorrow morning. Tomorrow is supposed to be my day." Preston was gathering his things, his movements sharp and angry. "I need some air," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. "This isn't how I expected tonight to go." Several other guests were quietly making their exits as well. The elegant rehearsal dinner had devolved into a family confrontation that was too private and painful for outsiders to witness. The carefully planned celebration was effectively over, but the wedding was still scheduled for the next morning with 200 guests expecting to see a happy couple exchange vows. Mom finally spoke up, her voice small and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "What happens now?" I looked around the room at the wreckage of what should have been a joyful celebration, at my sister, whose lies had finally caught up with her, at my parents, who were realizing they'd been manipulated by their own daughter, at the guests who were learning that the family they thought they knew was built on deception, at Preston, who was discovering that his fiancée had constructed their entire engagement on a foundation of lies about her own family. "Now," I said, looking directly at Mom, "everyone gets to decide what they actually want, instead of what Cassandra told them they should want." As David and I walked toward the exit, Dad caught up with us in the hallway outside the private dining room. His face looked older than it had an hour earlier, etched with the kind of regret that comes from realizing you've failed someone you love. "Wait," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "I need to apologize. We should have asked you directly what you wanted instead of taking Cassandra's word for it. We should have known our own daughter well enough to question whether you'd really changed so fundamentally." I stopped walking and turned to face the man who'd raised me, who'd worked double shifts at the hardware store to fund our college accounts, who'd been so thoroughly manipulated by one daughter that he'd failed the other without even realizing it. Despite everything, I could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. This wasn't a performative apology designed to smooth things over. This was a man confronting the reality of his own failures as a parent. "Dad," I said carefully, "you should have questioned it. The person Cassandra described bore no resemblance to the daughter you'd raised for 23 years, but I also should have spoken up sooner instead of assuming you knew me well enough to see through her lies." He nodded, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Can we start over? Can we be there for your wedding, the way we should have been all along?" I looked at this man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework and celebrated every small achievement throughout my childhood. He'd been an imperfect parent, susceptible to manipulation and too willing to believe the easy narrative over the complicated truth, but he was also genuinely trying to make amends. "Dad, David and I would love to have you at our wedding, both you and Mom, but only if you're there because you want to celebrate with us, not because you feel guilty about Cassandra." He reached out and hugged me then, the kind of desperate embrace that parents give children when they realize how close they've come to losing them. "We want to celebrate with you," he whispered. "We should have been celebrating you all along." As we reached the parking lot, David stopped walking and turned to face me under the amber glow of the streetlights. "Are you okay?" he asked, searching my face for signs of distress. That was more intense than we expected. I looked back at the country club where the lights were still on and the drama was undoubtedly continuing. Tomorrow, Cassandra would have to decide whether to go through with a wedding where half the guests now knew the truth about how it was funded. Preston would have to decide whether he could marry someone who'd built their relationship on lies from the very beginning. But those were their choices to make, their consequences to face. "I'm more than okay," I told David, feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this whole thing started, I feel free. The next morning, Cassandra's wedding proceeded as scheduled, but it was a subdued affair that bore little resemblance to the fairy tale celebration she'd envisioned. Several family members had declined to attend after learning the truth about how the wedding was funded. Others came but sat in uncomfortable silence as Cassandra walked down the aisle in her $8,000 dress, knowing that every flower, every candle, every elegant detail had been paid for with money stolen from her sister's future. Preston went through with the ceremony, but his vows were stilted and formal, lacking the passionate declarations of love that wedding guests expect to hear. During the reception, he spent more time talking to his groomsmen than dancing with his new wife. The photographer captured images of a beautiful wedding, but anyone looking closely could see the strain in the couple's faces, the forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Cassandra tried to salvage the celebration by posting carefully curated photos on social media, but the comments from family members who'd witnessed the rehearsal dinner drama told a different story. Cousins and aunts who'd once praised her wedding planning now left lukewarm congratulations that felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. 3 weeks later, Cassandra called me. Her voice sounded small and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Can we meet somewhere private?" We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, neutral territory where neither of us had the home field advantage. Cassandra looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by dark circles under her eyes and hair that hadn't been professionally styled in weeks. She launched into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed apology, full of explanations about pressure and expectations and childhood insecurities. She talked about how she'd always felt like she had to be perfect to get attention in our family, how she'd convinced herself that manipulating the situation was the only way to get what she needed. "Preston and I are in counseling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says he can't trust me anymore. He keeps asking what else I've lied about, and honestly, I'm not sure I remember where the truth ends and the stories begin." I listened to her carefully crafted explanation, recognizing the same manipulation tactics she'd always used, just directed toward generating sympathy rather than getting her way. When she finished, I told her I forgave her, because holding on to anger would only poison my own happiness, and because she was still my sister despite everything she'd done. But I also told her that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. That rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, not just words and explanations. That she'd need to prove through her behavior that she was capable of telling the truth, even when it was inconvenient or unflattering. I meant what I said about forgiveness, but I also knew that our relationship would never be the same. How could I trust someone who'd spent months systematically destroying my reputation with our own family? How could I confide in someone who'd used my confidences as weapons against me? 2 months later, our wedding day arrived like a gift I'd never dared to hope for. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that makes everything look like a painting. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, where I'd spent the night so Mom could help me get ready the way she'd always imagined she would for her daughter's wedding. She came into my room carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the kind of smile I hadn't seen from her in years, genuine joy, untainted by obligation or resignation. "How did you sleep?" she asked, settling beside me on the bed like she used to when I was little and had nightmares. "Surprisingly well," I admitted. "I thought I'd be nervous, but I just feel ready." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. When you know it's right, the details don't seem as scary. The getting ready process was everything I'd dreamed of but never expected to have. Mom helped me into my dress, a simple but elegant gown I'd found at a bridal consignment shop, beautiful in its understated grace. My best friend Rachel did my hair and makeup, keeping everything natural and classic. But the most meaningful moment came when Grandma arrived carrying a small velvet box. "This was your great-grandmother's," she said, pulling out a delicate pearl necklace that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in our family. "I wore it when I married your grandfather, and your mother wore it at her wedding. I'd like you to have it." As she fastened it around my neck, I felt connected to all the women who'd come before me, who'd made their own commitments to love despite uncertainty, who'd chosen hope over fear. The church was perfect in its simplicity. We'd decorated with flowers from the farmer's market and candles from the dollar store, but the result was warm and intimate in a way that no professional decorator could have achieved. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. David waited for me at the altar wearing his best suit and the kind of smile that made my heart skip beats. Pastor William stood beside him with the same gentle presence he'd brought to every important moment of my childhood, baptisms and confirmations and Christmas pageants. As I walked down the aisle with both parents beside me, a last-minute decision that felt perfect for our situation, I saw the faces of people who'd chosen to be there because they wanted to celebrate love, not because they felt obligated or guilty. My nursing school friend sat in the 3rd row, beaming with excitement for the classmate who'd found her person. David's medical school colleagues filled the left side of the church, having driven hours to witness their friend's happiness. Extended family members who'd learned the truth about Cassandra's manipulation had made the effort to attend, wanting to show their support for the wedding that should have been celebrated all along. Even some unexpected faces appeared. 3 of Cassandra's bridesmaids had come, apparently feeling guilty about their role in perpetuating the lies about who I was. They sat quietly in the back, but their presence felt like a small gesture toward healing the divisions that had torn our family apart. The ceremony itself was everything I'd never known I wanted. Pastor Williams spoke about love as a choice rather than a feeling, about the courage required to promise your life to another person when the future is uncertain. David and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to see each other clearly, to support each other's dreams, and to choose each other again every day. When David slipped the wedding band onto my finger, I thought about all the lies that had been told about me, all the times I'd been told I didn't want this kind of love, this kind of commitment, this kind of celebration. Now I was standing in front of everyone who mattered, claiming my right to be seen and known and celebrated for who I really was. The reception at the community center was a potluck affair where everyone contributed something. Grandma's famous apple pie, my college roommate's homemade pasta salad, David's mother's prize-winning chocolate cake. It wasn't elegant or professionally catered, but it was full of love and laughter and the kind of authentic joy that money can't buy. Dad gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes, apologizing publicly for the mistakes he'd made and promising to be a better father and grandfather. Mom danced with David and told him he was getting a daughter who would never let him settle for less than he deserved. But the most meaningful moment came when the photographer, my nursing school friend who'd traded her services for textbook money, pulled me aside for some final portraits as the evening light faded. "You know what's interesting?" she said as she adjusted her camera settings. "I've shot a lot of weddings, and you can always tell which couples are performing happiness versus which ones are actually living it. You and David, you're living it." As I looked around at the celebration we'd created, simple, authentic, full of people who'd chosen to love us, I realized she was right. This wasn't a performance or a display of wealth or status. This was a genuine celebration of two people choosing each other with clear eyes and full hearts. 6 months after our wedding, Cassandra and Preston divorced. The marriage had been doomed from the moment the lies were exposed, built on a foundation too weak to support the weight of real partnership. Preston filed papers citing irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real issue was trust that had been shattered beyond repair. The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of Cassandra's deception. She'd hidden credit card debt, lied about her job prospects, and continued manipulating family relationships even after the wedding. Preston's lawyer painted a picture of systematic dishonesty that went far beyond the wedding funding situation. Cassandra moved back in with our parents, who were finally learning to set boundaries with their golden child. They enrolled in family therapy together, working through decades of dysfunction and favoritism that had enabled Cassandra's manipulative behavior while neglecting my emotional needs. The therapy sessions were difficult but necessary. Mom and Dad had to confront the reality that they'd participated in creating a family dynamic where one child learned that lying was rewarded, while the other learned that her authentic self wasn't worthy of attention or celebration. Mom called me after one particularly difficult session, her voice thick with regret. "The therapist asked us to describe both of our daughters," she said. "When we talked about Cassandra, we had all these stories about her dreams and ambitions and personality. When we tried to describe you, we realized we'd been talking about what you did, not who you are. We turned you into a function instead of a person. It was a painful but necessary recognition. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the practical one, the one who didn't need attention or celebration. They'd loved me, but they'd loved a version of me that existed to make their lives easier, not a complex human being with my own dreams and desires. As for me, I threw myself into building the life David and I had envisioned together. I graduated from nursing school debt-free, thanks to the college fund money Mom and Dad ultimately gave back to me, along with a formal apology and a promise to treat both daughters equally going forward. I took a position in pediatric oncology at the children's hospital where David and I had met. It was challenging work, dealing with families facing their worst nightmares, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every day, I got to witness the kind of love that doesn't need lies or manipulation to survive. The love of parents willing to sacrifice everything for their children. The love of siblings supporting each other through unimaginable trials. David completed his residency and accepted a position in emergency medicine at the same hospital. We bought a small house with a garden where I could grow the flowers that had become my weekend hobby. Nothing fancy or impressive, just a place that reflected who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. The most surprising development came 2 years after our wedding, when I received a letter from Preston. He'd heard about my work in pediatric oncology and wanted to make a donation in memory of the marriage that should have been built on truth rather than deception. But more than that, he wanted to apologize for his role in enabling Cassandra's lies. He'd suspected that something wasn't right with her version of events, but he'd been so focused on planning a wedding that would impress his family and friends that he hadn't asked the hard questions that might have revealed the truth. The donation he made was substantial enough to fund a new family support program at the hospital, providing resources for parents who had to take extended time off work to care for sick children. We named it the Truth and Healing Fund, a reminder that authentic relationships require courage and honesty, even when the truth is uncomfortable. 3 years after our wedding, David and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope, partly for the quality she represented and partly because she was conceived during the most hopeful period of our lives. Holding her for the first time, I marveled at the idea that this perfect little person would grow up in a family where truth was valued over performance, where love was expressed through presence rather than manipulation. Cassandra met her niece when Hope was 6 months old. She'd been working with a therapist to address her pattern of dishonesty and had made genuine progress toward becoming a more authentic person. The meeting was awkward at first, both of us unsure how to navigate our changed relationship. But as I watched Cassandra hold Hope, carefully, tenderly, with none of the calculated manipulation that had characterized her interactions with adults, I saw glimpses of the sister I'd grown up with before the lies took over. Maybe there was hope for healing after all. "She's beautiful," Cassandra said quietly, not looking at me. "You're going to be an amazing mother." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us probably thinking about the family we'd grown up in and the family I was now creating. The contrast was stark but not hopeless. Patterns could be broken, truth could triumph over deception, love could survive betrayal if both people were willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. As hope grew, she became a bridge between past and future, helping our fractured family learn new ways of relating to each other. Grandparents who'd once played favorites now focused on being present and supportive. An aunt who'd once lied compulsively now practiced radical honesty, sometimes to an uncomfortable degree but always with genuine intent. The wedding that was supposed to be the end of Cassandra's fairy tale became the beginning of my real story, a life built on authentic love, genuine partnership, and the courage to insist on being seen for who I really am. Not the practical sister or the responsible one or the career-focused twin, but simply a woman who deserves to be loved and celebrated and chosen every single day. Sometimes the most beautiful weddings aren't the most expensive ones. Sometimes they're the ones where truth wins over lies, where authenticity triumphs over performance, where two people choose each other with clear eyes and honest hearts. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply living authentically and refusing to let anyone else write your story. Looking back now, I can see that Cassandra actually gave me a gift, though certainly not the one she intended. By trying to erase my dreams, she forced me to examine what I really wanted from life. By attempting to rewrite my story, she compelled me to reclaim my own narrative. By lying about who I was, she motivated me to show everyone who I really am. The family dynamics that had seemed so fixed and permanent turned out to be more fragile than any of us realized. With enough pressure applied in the right places, even the most entrenched patterns could shift. Golden children could fall from grace. Invisible children could step into the light. Parents could learn to see their children as complex individuals rather than simple categories. 5 years later, our family looks nothing like it did during that rehearsal dinner confrontation. We're smaller in some ways, no longer held together by shared delusions or comfortable lies, but we're also stronger, built on a foundation of truth that can weather the storms that destroyed our previous dynamic. David and I recently celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we had our first official date. As we talked about the future we're building together, our work at the hospital, our plans for more children, our dreams of traveling and growing old together, I marveled at how different my life might have been if I'd accepted Cassandra's version of who I was. What if I'd believed that I was too practical for romance, too career-focused for marriage, too different from other women to deserve celebration? What if I'd settled for the small, forgettable wedding that everyone expected, never realizing that I had the right to ask for more? But I didn't settle. I fought for my right to be seen and known and celebrated. I insisted on telling my own story, rather than letting someone else write it for me. And in doing so, I discovered that the most radical act isn't always rebellion. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be invisible. The wedding invitation we'd given Mom and Dad 5 years earlier still hangs framed in their kitchen, a reminder of the celebration that almost didn't happen and the daughter they almost lost to someone else's lies. Sometimes I catch them looking at it with expressions I can't quite read, pride mixed with regret, joy tempered by the knowledge of how close we all came to a very different ending. But we didn't get a different ending. We got this one, messy and complicated and more beautiful than any fairy tale because it's built on truth. We got second chances and hard conversations and the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust between people who love each other despite their failures. We got the wedding that was supposed to be impossible and the marriage that was supposed to be too practical to celebrate. We got the family that was supposed to be too broken to heal and the future that was supposed to be too ordinary to hope for. Most importantly, we got the truth. And in the end, that turned out to be worth everything.